Hello there, and welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. And today, I am delving into the Disney vaults to discuss the, purportedly, the film that Disney wanted to bury. That is 1985's The Black Cauldron. It's funny, I grew up, like most kids, I grew up with the 90s Renaissance Disney, with Lion King is one of my favourite films of all time. Beauty and the Beast, Hunchback of Notre Dame, Mulan, these are films that I grew up and loved. But I was just at the perfect age that meant that I also grew up with what they very nicely refer to as the Dark Age of Disney animation, when we'd gone past the classics and we were in that period where they were experimenting with what kinds of stories they wanted to tell, and they were trying to, of course, with the passing of Walt Disney, they were trying to redefine what Disney's remit of stories could be. So of course you end up with The Rescuers and The Rescuers Down Under, you end up with Basil the Grey Mouse Detective, and you end up with The Black Cauldron. And it was a series of hit and miss where it just, this is a period where Disney wasn't the most popular thing in the world during the 80s. And it was a while before, of course, we reached, I think it was Little Mermaid that relaunched Disney into the stratosphere, whereas these films are beloved, but they're not the showstoppers that Disney aimed for, both earlier and later within its history. But it means you do get these gems. You get films like Basil the Great Mouse Detective is a phenomenal film. Fox and the Hound is a beautiful and melancholy story about friendship. And this, I remember loving this because I think I watched this around the same time as I watched Fantasia as a kid. And so this sort of whirling, fantastical visual style really appealed. I've always loved fantasy. Fantasy is a genre that I think, it's very hard to do right, but when it is done right, it captures something beautiful and otherworldly, and yet at the same time relatable. Of course, as I've mentioned, that started this series 140 odd episodes ago with Lord of the Rings. I will always refer back to Stardust, the Neil Gaiman, the adaptation of the Neil Gaiman novel, as a beautiful telling of a fantasy story. And even going into sort of the 80s era, where you have the puppeteered films like Dark Crystal and Labyrinth. I think those, and even things like Legend, which I wouldn't say I love, but I remember with a great deal of fondness, and there are certain moments in it that are great. And this probably is in that same camp as Legend, where I have a distinct memory of certain things that were visually amazing. The Horned King is one of those villains that I think, if he'd come out at the right time, he would be up there in the top tier of Disney villains, because he is genuinely terrifying and haunting. You have the witches, who again they are interesting to look at, and yes, they are derivative of your traditional trio of witches, which of course people attribute to Shakespeare, but I think it predates it. I think it goes right back to Old English mythology, the idea of Trinity and the Virgin, the Mother, and the Hag or the Whore, depending on which variations you hear of, and that's very much within that spirit. But again, the way that they're represented as barely earthly, practically half ethereal all of the time. And of course the cauldron itself, and the army that's raised from it, and the sequence in which they march out is genuinely great. The unfortunate thing about it, and on this rewatch that I realised, is that the film is definitely not the sum of its parts. There are moments of brilliance in it, but there are things that just don't quite work. And I did know that going in, and I wanted to deconstruct what the issues were and why Disney, as I say, reputedly wanted to bury this so that no one ever remembered it, and they don't like talking about Black Cauldron. It's one of those ones that they seem to hate. Now, frankly, there are other Disney films that they should be putting above this on that list. In terms of they should want to bury and for people to forget. You know, Song of the South, for instance. But I understand. I understand the issue with this. I don't know. I understand that on the one level, yes, this is them. This is a big flop for them. This didn't work. It didn't appeal to American audiences. It isn't remembered particularly well. And again, it doesn't measure up to even films of that period like Basil, like Fox and the Hound, like Sword and the Stone. But I think that's a shame. I think, if anything, the worst you can say is that it's mediocre. And as I say, there are moments where it's brilliant, genuinely visually brilliant, but it's mediocre as a whole. It was interesting, because as I was saying, you know, fantasy is a hard genre to do without essentially telling the same story over and over again. I don't know why that is, because I do think if you read mythology, if you read Greek classics, if you read Celtic stories, I mean, this is derived from the Mabinogi, the ancient Welsh series of folk tales that are practically like Ovid's Metamorphosis. You know, that there's a whole range of stories and epic tales that, of course, you know, Tolkien in his writing really recaptures. But in terms of at least cinematic depictions of fantasy, there is the issue where it falls into a very standard hero's journey structure. And then it becomes a question of whether you're able to build upon that. So, you know, like I say, Stardust, Lord of the Rings, genuinely phenomenal films, but they are about a character who has a particular journey, and they meet a series of characters and events that have knock-on sort of relationships to each other, and it's this happens and then this happens and it causes this to happen so that they can acquire this object so that they can do this. And that, unfortunately, seems to be the hallmark of fantasy, cinematic fantasy. But I do think that it's very much a question of presentation and showing a deep and interesting world. And I think the problem that Black Cauldron has is it feels very flat at times, or it feels very empty. So there are points, long stretches in the narrative where it focuses on character, which isn't a bad thing. But okay, Taran is not the most interesting character in the world. He is, in fact, a very bland character from beginning to end. Like, he does have the hero's journey, and he does hit the right beats, but frankly, and I think the way he's written, he's just very dull to follow. He is a character who is there to just, you know, have aspirations and then achieve those aspirations in ways that he didn't expect. But he is a very boring character, and he is very hard to pay attention to. So when he gets companions and they start to build up, frankly, you know, you have Elonwy, who is a genuinely quite a good princess, and has more character to her and is more interesting. Or you have the bard, or you have the fairies, and even even Grogi, which I know Grogi is not a popular character, but I genuinely don't dislike him as much as other people, as sort of fan reactions are to him. Yes, he is a little annoying. Yes, the voice I don't think works, but frankly, I like the design and I like the arc of the character. It's just like I say, the problem is Taran is dull, and I think the problem, and like I say, that sort of feeds back into lots of parts of the film where you're character building, so you're spending time in an empty space, practically, like empty fields, areas where it's supposed to be interactions between characters for comedic effect, and it's supposed to be character building, but it frankly just makes it feel dull and paced. This is not a long film; it's 81 minutes, and there are just sections in this that really stretch out where you think, could you not? On the one hand, my instinct is edit it out. You could edit this down, but you can't edit this down anymore. This film is already short enough. And frankly, it's because it needs padding. It needs building up, not stripping down. You know, as I said, the Horn King is such a cool character. You know, he's an interesting looking design. He's voiced by John Hurt. He has the right authority, and yet we know very little about him. You meet his henchmen, who are frankly very generic. There's only one who really has a particular voice, and he is frankly a little annoying. And you have the rest of the henchmen that are just sort of a mass, you might say, of just bodies, and they needed fleshing out. You know, you have all these landscapes and areas that the characters go through, but again, they go from meadows to swamps to castles to barren landscapes, but you don't feel like you're learning anything about the land around them. It's very much a get to one, get to one, get to the next, get to the next, and that's the problem. Like I say, it's the same issue as I have with Eragon, which is it feeds into something that I refer to as my first fantasy, where fantasy requires, for fantasy to work, you need a sense of lore. You need a sense of scale where this is part of a grand... either this is the culmination of a grand story that has taken place over thousands of years and there's so much meaning and story behind it, or this is only one story that you're seeing within a great tapestry of stories that are alluded to but you don't get the full picture of. Now, this film does reference that. It does give you like an origin of the Black Cauldron through narration at the beginning, but frankly, it's so quickly gone over, and then we just have the story and, okay, now we know what the Black Cauldron is, that you don't get that sense of scale and lore and, you know, meaning to it. It's just, oh, it is a MacGuffin at the end of the day. You don't really understand what the witches are. I mean, they're witches, but, you know, like I say, to avoid my first fantasy, what are they beyond just being, you know, dealers of, you know, allowing the character to acquire the MacGuffin? And that's the problem on every level, which is it just simply doesn't go deeper than it should. And again, it does suffer from other things, like the fact that the animation style, though I think there are moments where it's genuinely haunting and beautiful, and as I say, I put it alongside Fantasia in my experience. It doesn't age well. It's weird that this is a film from the 1980s when it feels like a film from maybe the late 60s, early 70s. Maybe, if I'm being generous, a little bit into the 70s, but it definitely feels at least a decade older than it is, and I think that doesn't help. And yeah, I don't know. I want to like this more. I want this to be remembered better, but I can't justify it when I watch it and I go, yes, I can see the problems that people have with it, because it's just not hit that plateau. We're in this period now where, of course, we're having the endless series of live-action remakes, and frankly, I think they're doing it all wrong. I am at my final straw with the live-action remakes, particularly after Lion King, and I think Aladdin came after, and I did see that, but Lion King was the point in which I realised I no longer wanted to see live-action remakes. And if it was incredibly critically lauded, that might have tempted me, but they haven't been. You know, I didn't see Mulan, I didn't see Dumbo, and I know there are several down the pipeline, and frankly, I'm not feeling the urge to go and see them unless I have to. Because I think, frankly, you know, why would you remake a classic like Lion King or Jungle Book or Cinderella or... see, some of them make sense. I liked the remake of Jungle Book. I thought Cinderella was an interesting... Kenneth Branagh very well adapted it. But to do it exclusively for the top tier Disney films, to me, makes no sense. We're going to get the Little Mermaid remake, and it's like, okay, but why? What can you be better than these films that are considered some of the greatest in Disney's plethora? Why not, to me, go back and look at the ones that are not received so well? Because it means you can be a bit more flexible with the narrative. You can actually go and take them and actually explore and go, okay, why didn't this work? Let's try to update it. Let's try to alter this in a way that might appeal better and yet keep the heart of the story. And it won't upset die-hard fans. Well, it might, but it won't. There isn't such a huge community of die-hard fans that it won't. That adapting it won't tarnish the remake because it's doing something different. And this is the case of that. Why not remake Black Cauldron? And to me, that's sort of the direction they should be going, is sort of taking ones that didn't do so well and trying that. If they're not going to do originals and they're going to be remaking for live action, do stories that frankly just people have forgotten and deserve reevaluation. But that's not their current thinking, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I genuinely think this has something to it, but I do appreciate that, as I say, the parts aren't the sum of the whole. Anyway, thank you for joining me. If you like this video, hit the like button, comment below, and share these videos because it does all help me in the algorithm. Check out my long back catalogue of videos, and please do hit that subscribe button and hit that little bell because that will give you notifications when new videos are uploaded. Follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I'm always tweeting about movies and TV shows, and of course I share the links once these are uploaded to YouTube. Thank you for joining me. Take care.